I stared at my son, trying to process what he was saying. His eyes were blazing with greed, and his voice was laced with entitlement. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm taking everything you have," he said, his voice rising. "You've been hiding $400,000 from me for years. It's time I took what's mine." I was shocked, but I knew I had to protect myself. I had worked hard for that money, and I wasn't about to let my son take it from me. "What are you talking about, son?" I asked, trying to stall for time. "Don't play dumb, Dad," he spat. "I know all about the $400,000. I know you've been hiding it from me, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." I was taken aback by his anger, but I knew I had to stay calm. I took a deep breath and tried to reason with him. "Son, I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "But even if I did have that kind of money, it's mine. I worked hard for it, and I'm not going to give it to you just because you demand it." My son's face turned red with rage, and he took a step closer to me. I could see the anger in his eyes, and I knew I had to be careful. "You're going to regret this, Dad," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to regret not giving me that money." I stood my ground, trying to show him that I wasn't afraid. But inside, I was scared. I knew my son was capable of doing some terrible things, and I wasn't sure what he was going to do next. As we stood there, locked in a standoff, I couldn't help but think about how things had gotten to this point. How had my son become so greedy and entitled? And what was I going to do to protect myself from him? As I stood there, trying to process the situation, my mind began to wander back to the past. I thought about how my son and I used to be close, how we would spend hours talking and laughing together. But over the years, things had changed. He had become more and more distant, and I had no idea why. I remembered the day he had come to me and asked for a loan. I had given it to him, hoping that it would help him get back on his feet. But instead, he had used the money to buy a fancy car and take a lavish vacation. I had been disappointed, but I had tried to brush it off, thinking that he would eventually learn his lesson. But now, as I looked at him, I realized that he had learned nothing. He was still the same entitled, selfish person he had always been. And I knew that I had to protect myself from him. "Dad, are you listening to me?" my son said, his voice breaking into my thoughts. I said, "I want that money, and I want it now." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "I'm not going to give you the money, son," I said. "It's mine, and I worked hard for it." My son's face turned red with rage, and he took another step closer to me. "You're going to regret this, Dad," he said. "I'm going to make sure you regret not giving me that money." I stood my ground, trying to show him that I wasn't afraid. But inside, I was terrified. I knew that my son was capable of doing some terrible things, and I wasn't sure what he was going to do next. As we stood there, locked in a standoff, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see my wife walking into the room. "What's going on here?" she asked, looking at my son and then at me. "Just a little discussion, dear," I said, trying to downplay the situation. But my wife wasn't fooled. She looked at my son and saw the anger in his eyes. "What's wrong, son?" she asked. "He's refusing to give me the money I deserve," my son said, his voice still laced with entitlement. My wife looked at me, and I could see the concern in her eyes. "We'll talk about this later, son," she said. "But for now, why don't you go to your room and calm down?" My son's face turned even redder with rage, but he eventually stormed out of the room. My wife turned to me and asked, "What's going on, dear? What's happening with our son?" I took a deep breath and tried to explain the situation. I told her about the $400,000 and how my son had demanded it from me. I told her about how I had tried to reason with him, but he had refused to listen. My wife listened to everything I had to say, and then she shook her head. "I don't know what to do, dear," she said. "I don't know how to help our son." I sighed and rubbed my temples. I was tired and stressed, and I didn't know what to do either. But I knew that I had to protect myself and my wife from our son's anger and entitlement. As we stood there, trying to figure out what to do, I heard a noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was trying to get our attention. I walked over to the window and looked outside. And what I saw made my heart skip a beat. I walked over to the window and looked outside, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. There was a black SUV parked across the street, and two men were standing outside, looking at our house. They were both dressed in suits, and they looked like they meant business. I felt a surge of fear run through my body as I realized that my son's demands had just taken a dark and sinister turn. I turned to my wife and whispered, "Come see this." She walked over to the window and looked outside, and her eyes widened in shock. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, "but I think it has something to do with our son's demands." The two men outside didn't seem to be doing anything, but they were still standing there, looking at our house. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. I felt a sense of unease wash over me as I realized that we were being watched. I didn't know what these men wanted, but I knew that it couldn't be good. I turned to my wife and said, "We need to call the police." She nodded in agreement, and we quickly made our way to the phone. As we waited for the police to arrive, the tension in the room grew thicker. My wife and I were both on edge, wondering what was going to happen next. The two men outside didn't move, but they seemed to be getting more and more agitated. I could see them talking to each other, their faces twisted in anger. I didn't know what they were saying, but I knew that it couldn't be good. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. My wife and I looked at each other, and then I got up to answer it. I looked through the peephole, and my heart sank. It was my son, and he was standing on the porch with a smug look on his face. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to talk to you about the $400,000, he replied, his voice dripping with entitlement. "I've brought some friends to help us discuss it." I felt a surge of fear run through my body as I realized that the two men outside were with my son. I didn't know what they were capable of, but I knew that I had to protect myself and my wife. "I'm not going to give you the money," I said, trying to sound firm. My son's face twisted in anger, and he said, "We'll see about that." The doorbell rang again, and I knew that the police had arrived. I opened the door, and two officers were standing there, looking at my son and the two men behind him. "Can we help you?" one of the officers asked. My son's face fell, and he said, "No, everything's fine." But the officers didn't believe him. They looked at the two men behind him, and then they looked at me. "What's going on here?" one of them asked. I took a deep breath and explained the situation. I told them about my son's demands, and about the two men who were with him. The officers listened to everything I had to say, and then they turned to my son. "You need to leave," one of them said. "And you need to take your friends with you." My son's face twisted in anger, but he knew that he was beat. He turned and walked away, the two men behind him. As they left, the tension in the room began to dissipate. My wife and I were shaken, but we were safe. For now. But as I looked out the window, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The black SUV was still parked across the street, and the two men were still standing outside, looking at our house. They hadn't left. And I knew that this was far from over. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched the two men standing outside our house. They hadn't left, despite the police telling them to. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. I turned to my wife and whispered, "They're still here." She followed my gaze and her eyes widened in fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unsure of what to do. The police had told them to leave, but they hadn't. It was as if they were defying the law. I decided to call the police again, to report that the men were still outside our house. As I waited for them to arrive, the tension in the room grew thicker. My wife and I were both on edge, wondering what was going to happen next. The two men outside didn't move, but they seemed to be getting more and more agitated. I could see them talking to each other, their faces twisted in anger. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again. I looked through the peephole, and my heart sank. It was one of the police officers who had been here earlier. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've had a report that the men are still outside your house," he replied. "We're going to need to take a statement from you and your wife." I nodded, and the officer came inside. He asked us a series of questions, taking down notes as we spoke. As we talked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The men outside were still there, watching us. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew that it couldn't be good. The officer finished taking our statement, and then he stood up to leave. "We'll do everything we can to keep you and your wife safe," he said. "But in the meantime, I want you to be careful. If you see anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call us." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as the officer left, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. One of the men outside had moved, and was now standing right outside our front door. He was looking at us, his eyes cold and calculating. I felt a surge of fear run through my body, and I knew that we were in grave danger. I turned to my wife and whispered, "He's moved. He's right outside our front door." She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unsure of what to do. The police had told us to be careful, but they hadn't told us what to do if the men came to our door. I decided to call the police again, to report that the man had moved. As I waited for them to arrive, the tension in the room grew thicker. My wife and I were both on edge, wondering what was going to happen next. The man outside didn't move, but he seemed to be getting more and more agitated. I could see him talking to himself, his face twisted in anger. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again. I looked through the peephole, and my heart sank. It was the man outside, and he was standing right outside our front door. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to talk to you," he replied, his voice cold and calculating. "I want to talk to you about the $400,000. I felt a surge of fear run through my body, and I knew that we were in grave danger. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to the man's words. He was talking about the $400,000 that my son had been demanding, and I knew that this was no coincidence. The man was somehow connected to my son, and he was here to collect the money. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing with fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to sound confident. But the man just smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "Don't play dumb," he said. "I know all about the $400,000. And I know that you're hiding it from your son." I felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but I knew that I had to keep my cool. "I don't know what you're talking about," I repeated, trying to sound firm. But the man just laughed, a cold and menacing laugh. "We'll see about that," he said. And with that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a court order," he said, waving the paper in my face. "It says that you have to hand over the $400,000 to your son within 24 hours. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I looked at the paper. It was a real court order, and it looked like it had been signed by a judge. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I had to act fast. I turned to my wife and whispered, "We need to call our lawyer." She nodded, and we quickly made our way to the phone. As we waited for our lawyer to arrive, the tension in the room grew thicker. The man outside was still standing there, watching us, and I could feel his eyes boring into my skin. I knew that he was waiting for us to make a move, and I knew that we had to be careful. Our lawyer arrived, and we quickly explained the situation to her. She listened carefully, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the court order. "This is a fake," she said, her voice firm. "I can tell by the way it's written. But we need to be careful. If this man is willing to go to such lengths to get the $400,000, then he's not going to give up easily." I felt a surge of relief at our lawyer's words, but I knew that we were far from safe. The man outside was still watching us, and I knew that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Our lawyer quickly came up with a plan, and we set it in motion. We would go to the police and report the fake court order, and we would also try to get a restraining order against the man. But as we left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. But I knew that the man was still out there, waiting for us. And I knew that he would stop at nothing to get the $400,000. As we walked to the police station, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The man was still out there, watching us, and I knew that we were in grave danger. But I was determined to protect myself and my wife, no matter what it took. We would get to the bottom of this, and we would make sure that the man was brought to justice. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pulled into a web of deceit and danger. And I knew that it would take all of our strength and courage to get out alive. As we walked to the police station, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The man was still out there, watching us, and I knew that we were in grave danger. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him following us. But there was no one there. I turned back to my wife and our lawyer, who were walking ahead of me. "Do you think we're being followed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Our lawyer turned around, her eyes scanning the street behind us. "I don't see anyone," she said. "But we need to be careful. If this man is willing to go to such lengths to get the $400,000, then he's not going to give up easily." I nodded, my heart racing with fear. We were getting close to the police station, and I could see the building up ahead. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as we walked inside. We were safe now, I thought. But as we approached the front desk, I saw a familiar face. It was the man who had been watching us, standing at the front desk, talking to one of the police officers. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that he was trying to intercept us. "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice loud and angry. The police officer turned around, a look of surprise on his face. "Can I help you?" he asked. "This man is trying to intercept us," I said, pointing at the man. "He's been following us, and we need to report him." The police officer looked at the man, who was still standing at the front desk. "Is this true?" he asked. The man smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "I'm just here to report a crime," he said. "These people are hiding $400,000 from me, and I need to get it back." I felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but I knew that I had to stay calm. "That's not true," I said, my voice firm. "This man is trying to intimidate us, and we need to report him." The police officer looked at us, his expression serious. "I'm going to need to take a statement from all of you," he said. "Please, follow me." We followed the police officer to a back room, where he took our statement. The man was still standing at the front desk, watching us, and I could feel his eyes boring into my skin. I knew that we were in grave danger, and I didn't know what to do. As we finished our statement, the police officer turned to us. "We're going to need to investigate this further," he said. "But in the meantime, I want you to be careful. This man is not to be trusted." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. We were safe now, I thought. But as we left the police station, I saw the man again, standing outside, watching us. I knew that we were far from safe, and I didn't know what to do. As we left the police station, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The man was still watching us, and I knew that we were in grave danger. But I was determined to protect myself and my wife, no matter what it took. We walked home in silence, our eyes scanning the street for any sign of the man. But he was nowhere to be seen. As we walked, I couldn't help but think about the past few days. It had been a roller coaster of emotions, from fear to anger to relief. But now, I was determined to take back control. I was determined to make sure that the man who had been terrorizing us was brought to justice. As we approached our house, I saw a police car parked outside. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that the police had finally taken action. I ran to the door, my wife following close behind. We burst inside, eager to see what was happening. And what we saw took our breath away. The man was standing in our living room, his hands cuffed behind his back. The police officer who had taken our statement was standing next to him, a smile on his face. "We've got him," he said, his voice triumphant. "He's not going to bother you again." I felt a surge of relief wash over me, followed by a wave of anger. How could this man have done this to us? How could he have terrorized us like this? I turned to the man, my eyes blazing with anger. "You're going to pay for what you've done," I said, my voice cold and hard. The man looked up at me, a smirk on his face. But it was too late. The police officer had already read him his rights, and he was being led away in handcuffs. As we watched him go, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. Justice had been served. But it wasn't just the man who had been brought to justice. It was also my son, who had been behind it all. The police officer turned to us, a serious expression on his face. "We've also arrested your son," he said. "He's going to face charges for his role in this." I felt a wave of emotions wash over me, from sadness to anger to relief. It was over. It was finally over. My wife and I hugged each other, tears of relief streaming down our faces. We had been through so much, but we had come out on top. We had taken back control, and we had brought our tormentors to justice. As we stood there, holding each other, I knew that we would never forget this experience. We would never forget the fear and the anger and the relief. But we would also never forget the strength and the courage that we had found within ourselves. We had faced our fears, and we had come out on top. And as we walked away from the house, hand in hand, I knew that we would always be okay. We had each other, and we had justice on our side.